forget that trip to Danalindu in Sigi, Sulawesi back in November 2020 after the terrorist attack. It was my first time setting foot in this dense forest. And I was blown away by the breathtaking beauty of the lake and the quaint little communities surrounding it. But suddenly, tragedy struck the community. The area fell victim to a brutal terrorist attack. Homes were burnt to ashes, and innocent lives were snuffed out in an instant. It's a memory that haunts me to this very day. Last week, I came across news articles about the arrest of the terrorist group responsible for the atrocity. Reading those stories stirred up all the painful memories from my trip, forcing me to relive that dark chapter in the region's history. Today's podcast is dedicated to discussing recent Indonesia terrorism news and delving insightful articles from RSS and CTC West Point. It's important for people to stay informed and aware of what's happening around them in these troubled times. So stay tuned and stay safe.
Welcome in, everyone, to another deep dive into Indonesia's terrorism situation. As always, I'm joined by one of the leading experts, I guess you could say, and we're going to try to unpack some of these stories that have been coming out. We've got some fresh news articles and some excerpts from a report from the Counter-terrorism Center, the CTC.
Right.
And as Densus 88, firsthand, this is a very complicated fight, but some of these recent developments might surprise you a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of a tale of two trends right now, where you have this very seemingly positive development with the voluntary dissolution of Jemaah Islamiyah,
Right.
JI, and thousands of former members pledging allegiance to the NKRI.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're still seeing Densus 88 having to carry out operations like the recent ones against Mujahidin Indonesia Timur,
Right.
MIT.
Yeah.
So it really kind of shows this fight is far from over.
Well, let's dig into that Jemaah Islamiyah story first, because you don't see a terrorist organization just sort of self-destruct every day.
Yeah.
But we're talking about a gathering in Solo, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Where an estimated 1,400 to 1,500 former members, including some high-ranking figures, publicly announced that they were dissolving JI and pledging their loyalty to the nation.
Right.
And thousands more did this online.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty significant number.
It is. It's, really unprecedented to have a group of this size and with the history of JI. To choose to disband and embrace the NKRI, it really raises some very interesting questions.
Yeah, and what's interesting, too, is the reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
Like, they're saying they want to contribute to Indonesia's progress in that.
Mm-hmm.
Their struggle should be for the nation, not against it.
Right. It's a real shift in narrative.
Yeah.
And it seems like the government is responding in kind with this focus on partnership and nation building and this sort of humanistic approach
Yeah.
of these former members.
Even Komjen Pol Eddie Hartono, the head of DMPT, he talked about how moved he was by the event, especially,
Yeah.
given, his past experiences with JI leaders who just stonewalled him.
Right.
So it seems like it could be a real turning point.
It's definitely something to watch.
Yeah.
But, while this is happening with JI, we also have to remember that Densus 88's operations against groups like MIT are ongoing. And that really highlights the complex and, I guess you could say, multifaceted nature of Indonesia's terrorism landscape.
Yeah, you're right. And even just recently, Densus 88 apprehended 3 individuals who were connected to MIT in central Sulawesi and Nusa Tenggara Barat.
Yeah.
And while Densus 88 is reporting that MIT's structure has been significantly weakened, these arrests, show that there are still individuals operating and supporting this group, which, emphasizes the need for continued vigilance.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to note that one of these individuals was reportedly active in radical social media groups. And this really highlights this growing trend we're seeing globally, the influence of online platforms in the process of radicalization.
Right.
It really shows how these spaces can facilitate the spread of extremist ideologies and connect individuals who hold similar views.
Yeah, and this really dovetails with the CTC report that we have, which delves into this rise of what they call REMVE terrorism, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism. And the report really emphasizes that the role of online platforms in fostering this type of terrorism is often misunderstood. It's not just about these networks going global, although the internet makes that easier.
Yeah.
But it's more about how these online communities become breeding grounds for the spread of these violent ideologies, even within specific regions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about these virtual echo chambers where these ideas can be amplified and reinforced.
Exactly.
And it goes beyond just online chatter. The report highlights a case study, the Telegram Collective, that really underscores these real-world consequences of these online interactions.
So this isn't just, people blowing off steam online. They're actively planning and inciting violence.
Precisely. The report actually connects this Telegram network to two separate attacks, one in Slovakia and another in Turkey. So it really shows how online incitement can have very real and devastating consequences across borders.
Yeah, it's like they might be physically located in different countries. They can connect through these platforms and share their ideologies and
Actually,
inspire indirect attacks.
exactly. It really highlights this evolving nature of the threat landscape, and it underscores the need for Densus 88 to be equipped to address these online dimensions of terrorism.
Yeah.
It's not just about traditional intelligence gathering and operations anymore. It's about understanding how these online spaces function and how they're being utilized to recruit, radicalize, and incite violence.
So we're really seeing two sides of the coin here, right? On one hand, we have this hopeful development of JI's dissolution, which, could potentially be a model for de-radicalization efforts. But on the other hand, we have the persistent threat of groups like MIT and this evolving challenge of online radicalization.
Yeah, absolutely. And it highlights the complexity of the situation. It requires this multi-pronged approach that addresses, both the ideological underpinnings of terrorism and the ways in which those ideologies are spread and reinforced, particularly through these online platforms.
Right. And speaking of complexities, this CTC report brings up another challenge that's particularly relevant to Densus 88's work.
Yeah.
And that's these children returning from ISIS territories.
Right.
Over 500 Indonesian women and children are currently in camps like Al-Hol. And their reintegration presents a significant challenge. I mean, many of these children were born into or brought to these conflict zones.
Yeah.
And exposed to violence and indoctrination from a very young age.
Yeah, it's a deeply concerning situation. And the report really underscores the complexities involved in their reintegration. I mean, these children have experienced trauma, their worldview has been shaped by extremist ideologies, and there's a real risk of them becoming vulnerable to recruitment or even perpetrating violence themselves.
Yeah, it sounds like a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And one that requires a very nuanced approach.
Absolutely. The report emphasizes the need for a comprehensive strategy. That includes things like psychological support, education, and community acceptance. These children need help processing their experiences, developing critical thinking skills, and reintegrating into a society that might be wary of them because of their background.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance between security concerns and the need to offer these children a chance to rebuild their lives and escape the cycle of extremism.
Precisely. And what's interesting is that Indonesia has faced a similar challenge in the past.
Really?
After suppressing the Darul Islam rebellion back in the mid-20th century, the government grappled with reintegrating the children of the rebels, many of whom had been exposed to violence and indoctrination. So the report points to this historical example as a potential source of insight for addressing this current challenge.
So there is some precedent, some model that Indonesia could potentially draw from.
Yeah, although the situation with these children returning from ISIS territories presents its own unique challenges, particularly given the influence of online radicalization.
Right.
The report actually mentions Indonesian teenagers who were implicated in terrorism-related cases between 2015 and 2018, really highlighting this potent influence of online platforms in shaping extremist views and inciting violence, even among young people within Indonesia.
So this isn't just a concern for the future, it's happening right now.
Exactly, and it underscores the need for Densus 88 to not only be aware of these online spaces, but also have the capabilities to monitor them, gather intelligence, and potentially intervene to disrupt the spread of these extremist ideologies and recruitment efforts.
Speaking of potential models, this CTC report also highlights another report from the RSIS in Singapore and West Point's Combating Terrorism Center.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these two reports, while focusing on different regions and contexts, arrive at similar conclusions about the evolving nature of terrorism and the need for new approaches to counter it. The RSIS report specifically focuses on Southeast Asia, highlighting this persistent threat of groups like Jemaah Islamiyah, even as it undergoes these internal shifts like we've been discussing.
So even with this positive development of JI's dissolution, the RSIS report is cautioning against complacency.
Exactly. The report emphasizes that JI's fragmentation doesn't necessarily equate to its disappearance. It might simply mean that the group is adapting, becoming more decentralized, and potentially even harder to track. And this really aligns with the CTC report's emphasis on the rise of lone actors and smaller, more loosely organized groups, often driven by online radicalization.
So both reports are pointing to this shift away from these traditional hierarchical terrorist organizations towards a more diffuse and decentralized threat landscape.
Precisely, and this presents a whole new set of challenges. For counterterrorism efforts, it requires a shift in focus from dismantling large organizations to addressing the ideological drivers of violence and the ways in which those ideologies are spread and amplified, particularly through online platforms.
Right. And the West Point report dives even deeper into this online realm, specifically focusing on REMVE terrorism.
Yeah, and what's particularly interesting is how this report highlights the transnational dimension of REMVE, emphasizing that it's not just a Western phenomenon, it's a global trend. And the internet has played a significant role in connecting individuals and groups with similar extremist ideologies, regardless of their physical location.
So these online communities are transcending geographical boundaries, creating this sort of virtual breeding ground for extremism.
Precisely, and this has implications for Densus 88's work as well. It means that the threat can come from both within Indonesia and beyond its borders, potentially inspired by ideologies and events happening in completely different parts of the world.
So it's not just about monitoring what's happening within Indonesia. It's about understanding the global trends, the online networks, and the ideologies that are driving this new wave of extremism.
Absolutely, and it requires a level of collaboration and information sharing that goes beyond traditional boundaries. It's about working with international partners, sharing intelligence, and developing strategies that can effectively address this transnational threat.
It seems like we're moving towards a more complex and interconnected world. And the fight against terrorism is reflecting that complexity.
It certainly is. And it demands a more nuanced and adaptable approach. From counterterrorism agencies like Densus 88, it's not just about reacting to events, it's about understanding the underlying dynamics, anticipating threats, and developing strategies that address both the immediate dangers and the long-term challenges of this evolving landscape.
Yeah, it really highlights just the multifaceted nature of the challenge, you know, and the need for Densus 88 to be agile and adaptable in its approach.
Absolutely. And as we kind of wrap up our deep dive today, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier, which was this concept of maximum disorder highlighted in the CTC report.
Right, you mentioned that refers to the idea that instability and chaos can be exploited by terrorist organizations to advance their agenda. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and how it might be relevant to the Indonesian context?
Sure. So the report suggests that groups like MIT might intentionally seek to perpetuate disorder and instability as a way to undermine government authority, create fear, and potentially gain support within certain communities. And this tactic could manifest in various ways, from, targeted attacks that disrupt public services, to spreading disinformation and propaganda online, to incite unrest and division within society.
So it's not just about the immediate impact of their attacks, it's about the broader societal consequences and how they can leverage those to their advantage.
Exactly. And this understanding is crucial for Densus 88. It means that the response can't just be focused on dismantling these groups and apprehending individuals. It needs to encompass a broader strategy that addresses the root causes of this instability, builds resilience within communities, and counters the narratives that these groups are using to exploit grievances and sow discord.
It sounds like a very complex and multifaceted approach that requires collaboration across various sectors, not just within law enforcement.
Precisely, it's about working with community leaders, religious institutions, educators, and even social media companies to address the factors that make individuals vulnerable to radicalization, to promote tolerance and understanding, and to create a more cohesive and resilient society.
It's a reminder that the fight against terrorism isn't just about military operations and intelligence gathering. It's about understanding the social, economic, and political dynamics that contribute to this problem and working to address those root causes.
Absolutely, and it's an ongoing process, a constant evolution as the threat landscape shifts and adapts. And Densus 88's role is not just to react to these changes, but to anticipate them, to be proactive in its approach, and to constantly seek new and innovative ways to counter these evolving threats.
Well, this has certainly been a very thought-provoking deep dive. The Indonesian terrorism landscape is a complex and ever-changing puzzle, with both hopeful signs and persistent challenges. From the unprecedented dissolution of JI to the ongoing operations against MIT and the growing threat of online radicalization, Densus 88 is facing a multifaceted adversary that demands a nuanced and adaptable response.
And I commend you and your colleagues for your unwavering dedication to this fight. Your work is crucial in safeguarding Indonesia's security. and ensuring the safety of its citizens.
Well, thank you. And all our Densus 88 listeners out there, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay engaged in this critical fight.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the evolving nature of this threat, the better equipped we'll be to counter it effectively and build a safer and more secure future for Indonesia.